welcome to folks joining via the recording. We have some modeling and API topics that we're going to talk through. I shall share my screen so you're not just looking at a black video. So on the last call, we talked about turning the brief text vocabulary item or classification, instead of classifying the text itself, the linguistic object, instead to make it a meta type for the type of statement. So instead of being this is a material statement and it is a brief text, you would instead have this is a material statement and material statements are brief texts. There was some discussion, as you can see, and I believe all of the comments were responded to, and Charlie says thanks for the explanation, it answers his misgivings, so that's good. We said on the call last time before the new year that we would ask on the mailing list for feedback and reference the issue. So there was some feedback that has been discussed. So for consistency and actually for ease of implementation even, I think that we should move ahead with this and sooner rather than later if we're going to do it, because it's a change that will affect pretty much every representation, because pretty much every representation has has a statement or a note or a description or some more. Are we okay with this change, or any misgivings about it? No? Is anyone wildly excited about it? No?
So, sorry, this is Dave. I just wanted to get a clarification. I'm kind of trying to feverishly read through the comments here,
but sorry. Yep.
not seeing it. But is this saying that that all material, that we're making an assertion that all materials statements are brief texts, or only this particular instance is a brief text?
Yeah, if it would be everything classified as materials, the concept of material statements are of type brief text. So thus, if you were to then classify a linguistic object as a material statement, then you're sort of inheriting brief text, which I think is fine, as I discussed with Charlie, because we have two different patterns. There's classification as a statement, which is always paralleled at the moment with classified as brief text. So this just makes it clearer that material statements are brief texts. If we wanted to say something was about materials, then we would use a different property. We'd say it was a subject. The subject of the linguistic object is materials, and this is where this issue came from originally. That's what we essentially used to say, that it was classified as materials rather than classified as material statement, and that meant that we certainly couldn't have the meta type pattern, because materials are not brief texts, but material statements by definition are. So, and also Patricia added a bunch of concepts to AAT for all of these statements to separate them from the subject. So now there's 300435429 material statement. So if you were using that as a concept for just materials, that wouldn't be correct. You should use whatever the materials subject is.
I think that's very helpful for standardization. My only concern, and I think maybe this is unavoidable, is would the classified as on the type essentially be, is there an opportunity for it to be inherited from the overall model, or does it by necessity need to be explicitly stated by every producer of linked art?
Yeah, so I think that, well, this is sort of an API question, but very relevant. From my perspective, I would say that we should be explicit about it, because if there are types that aren't well known, can't think of one off the top of my head because otherwise it would be well known. If you wanted to have a subject note, I don't know, totally random, and subject note isn't in the typical vocabulary or implementation of linked art consuming applications, you would want to know that it was to be treated like a statement generally, even if you don't understand what, whatever I said, subject note or some local term actually meant. So I think the benefit of doing the meta typing really only comes when it's explicit in the representations, because then you can skip over the intermediate level if you don't know it, or if you do know it, you can ignore the meta type because you already know what the regular type is.
Yeah, I think it's a slippery slope to start pulling these out and relying on the model as opposed to being explicit. But I just, I wanted to talk about it so that, it's like a tenet of the approach, really.
Yeah. Yes, and when you have a lot of statements, it becomes quite a lot of, at least three additional lines of content that just gets apparently repeated over and over and over again. But for consistency and for computability, it seems better to be explicit and verbose than implicit and concise. Okay, thank you. Any further questions or discussion?
Yeah, actually, I've got two questions. One directly related to what you've said about explicit information, because that also leads us to the direction of discussing what should be explicit, and because the type has some other features that we could also want to materialize.
Mm-hmm.
So is it something that we should embark on at some point, or? And why should we expect that the type, the meta type is always explicit and not other attributes of the type?
Yep. Yeah, a scoping, a good scoping question. So I think it depends on how we would anticipate the information being used. So for this particular piece of information about the type, we can justify why it's important for consumers to have it. And I think that would be the case for any of the other properties of the type as well. So if in consuming the resource's description that has this material statement, as a consuming application, knowing that it's a material statement and material statements are brief text seems valuable. Knowing that a brief text is a narrower term than text is probably not as helpful. But yeah, as with any scoping decision, I think that having data and use cases and usage scenarios separate from data production use cases should help inform what what we make explicit and what we simply allow the client to find out from dereferencing, in this case, AAT material statement, rather than having it sort of imported into the current representation. But yeah, if there's particular things that you think would be good to discuss, we can certainly discuss them. And yeah, making an issue for it so that we can keep it on the radar would be good.
So I would have then a second question, which would actually make the discussion on the first question even more complex.
Mm-hmm.
How about meta types?
Yeah.
So Ethan's suggestion to apply brief text only to statement, which I expect is the broader concept of material statements. I'm kind of interested in that, and from the discussion, I cannot see it clearly rejected. Am I right? So could all statements be brief text, and we would rely on this?
Yes, I think all of the things that we call statements in linked art are types of brief text. And maybe also that brief text is just not a good label for it as a meta type rather than as a type. It's a type of statement, type of brief text as opposed to a brief text. Yeah. But maybe I'm missing the question. Well,
Ethan suggested to apply the meta type on statements, which would be conceptually rather elegant. So any specialization of statement then could be expected to be of the same meta type as statements. So we would say that AT statements is brief text, and then all specialization, including material statement, would inherit this.
Oh, I see. Yes. I'm not sure that AT has such a useful such a hierarchy. We can probably find out. Pick one of the new ones.
Well, Charlie has mentioned other kind of siblings. I mean, at least they look like siblings. So cataloging statement, descriptive cataloging, and then AT statement. Or were there suggestions for new concepts?
A lot, yeah. So a lot of the statements are in this categories of information, which I guess could actually be well, it's not really the right meta type, but not all of them. So there's blah note or blah description or display biography, materials description, but also this one, object work type category, language category, titles and names. So the issue, of course, that we have throughout the work is that vocabulary, unless we were to make our own vocabulary very specific to what we were doing, which would, I think everyone agrees is a non-starter, the alignment between existing vocabularies and the SciDoc CRM abstract model is always going to be not 100%. And we can do the best we can, and we can work with both the CRM folks and with the vocabulary folks to make sure that the alignment is as good as possible, but relying on both of them to sort of independently be in alignment, and not only now, but also in the future, seems like we would be tying them too tightly together. And hence we should be a little bit, well, we should not rely on the vocabulary structure for linked art-specific affordances or modeling, we should be explicit about it if it's needed. Am I being at all clear?
Trying to reformulate, you would not rely on the existence of a broader, narrower link in the vocabulary to infer meta types that we would find useful.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. That's it precisely. Because such a link may not exist, and in this case doesn't. Right. The brief text is not anywhere in this particular hierarchy. It's in a completely different hierarchy. Yeah, this is under multidisciplinary concepts, which is probably totally accurate for AAT, but not very useful for us.
Where's material statement for in AAT? Because I don't see it.
Materials / technique description.
Ah, okay. Sorry.
Yep, no problem.
Actually, this thing looks like it's not necessarily brief text.
Yes, exactly. This is the one that Patricia added for us for materials notes, medium of work, etc., etc. So yes, I think this is an ongoing discussion that we should have in person in a couple of weeks about, as a follow-up to the Oxford discussion, where we sort of made a little working group to try to come up with some vocabulary recommendations. Perhaps on the Thursday in Philadelphia, we could look back at that and try to come up with some next steps for aligning vocabulary and ontology within the profile.
I would say this could be useful before solving the specific issue we are considering, because I mean, if you were talking about material statements and that ended up being represented with a concept label, not statement but description, I mean, I'm kind of feeling a bit uncomfortable why Patricia would not have liked the statement label.
One of the AAT sort of ground rules is that they can't invent labels, even if someone suggests it. There has to be a warrant for the particular label, as opposed to for the concept. So if no one has called it a material statement in some text or not necessarily even a peer-reviewed text, but unless they can find somewhere where it's called material statement exactly, then they look for some other name that's better used. So looking at the sources, clearly they went to CDWA, which probably calls it a materials description. I would hazard a guess. And that's not a good link. And I can't highlight it. And hence just used that label for the concept. Yeah, so okay, so they borrowed exactly the section heading from CDWA, and these are all exactly what we mean, right? Oil on canvas.
So could it be that material statement could be added as an alternate name for materials description? The way, there are multiple synonyms per concept, usually in DAT or even ULAN or, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly ask Patricia. If one of the easy way to get that done, and for all of them, would be to find somewhere where it's referred to as a statement. And then, or we could change our terminology to talk about descriptions, but I think statement is a good label for us too. But I can ask if we can have a use for term for all these, which says statement.
And with respect to the strength or the yeah, the how to say that, the formal validity of the meta typing, can we do with situation where the text would not be so brief? And like, actually, if you look at the CWA page, the last example, and of course it's always the last example, is not so brief. So are we still okay saying, okay, but look at those cases, 95% are brief, so we'll go with the meta typing, even though we know that there are some exceptions?
Yeah, and exactly what brief means is another question as well, right? But that is still brief compared to a an entire chapter describing the materials. I think what we mean is it's short enough that we can include the content directly in the description of the object, other than referring to it as an external document. This doesn't really seem like a material statement either, but maybe this footnote explains why it is. Don't know. Yes, but as you say, the vast majority of those examples, and indeed the vast majority of all of the examples we've looked at for these sorts of things, are about 1 or 2 sentences with the occasional paragraph, I guess. The time. So thank you, everyone. Are we okay with making it the meta type at this point, or do we want to discuss the structure some more next week, in 2 weeks' time? And well, Antoine and David, are you okay with the change, or seems as you're the ones to?
Yeah, I'm okay.
I'm okay with it.
Right, last call. Done. All right, so it's 10 minutes. There is another one that we could probably close, which was from our first face-to-face last year. Influenced by does have a specific meaning in art history, which isn't exactly the same as influenced by in CRM, but it's sort of a very large overlap. So there was a proposal to rename it, which sort of died out in June. So I asked whether we could, what we should do with this one, and a good discussion about when influences are actually used, broke out, style after, copyist, manner of, style of, etc., etc. No need to read everything. But at the end of the day, it seems like influenced by is not a terrible name for the property. And we have 229 for discussing production qualifiers. So my proposal is that we can close this issue about the name of influenced by in the JSON LD, and continue to talk about production qualifiers in the space of 229. But Adam and Emmanuel in particular, thoughts on this one?
To be clear, I only filed this ticket just on behalf of Marlena and Emmanuel and a few other folks for the face-to-face, so I have no useful opinion. So
yeah, and then yeah, Emmanuel or anyone else.
It seems appropriate when there is actual granular data to back up the use of that property, right? So i.e. if you're using one of those attribution qualifiers, then it makes sense that you would use this property.
Yep.
But that comes with a big if, right? I mean, but those attribution qualifiers again are referenced you know, both in CDWA and CCO.
Yep.
So they are not strange things. And we can't control what people will do eventually. But at least, you know, I think the use we're thinking about here is steeped in standards, and so I think for me it's a go.
Mm-hmm. Any other objections, or any objections to closing the issue and continuing the discussion about influences in the 229 issue? Okay, good. All right, and so those were the, oops. So for Philadelphia, we clearly won't do it now, but this link back in the agenda, overview of issues, is all of the modeling issues that are not marked as discussed and I just need to document them, defer for a future discussion, or blocked, or otherwise we can't move forwards on. There's about 33 if I recall correctly. So I will, between now and then, try to order them into some coherent groups. But if you have a chance to look over them so that we're not entering the discussion cold, over the next couple of weeks would be very useful. And with 5 minutes left, we probably don't have time to talk through URIs in any great detail, but David, thank you for your emails and discussion about them since the last call. Is there, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, is there some things that you would like everyone to be thinking about before in-person discussion in a couple of weeks' time, that we could be...
About URIs in particular?
Yeah, about the URI structure and
yeah, I mean, so what I'm going through here is working with Sarah in our library to develop an authoritative URI scheme, starting with images, actually, because we have some IIIF work we're doing with our enterprise DAM, and so that kind of raised the whole discussion of how, you know, what are some ways that we can develop a model for URIs in general that can be extended to accommodate whatever other types of entities we need to mint URIs for here at the gallery. So, you know, our efforts in this are, you know, very early. We have some URIs we've used in the past for certain online publications that we're maintaining as persistent URLs, but I would not call those authoritative URIs for the purpose of linked art. It certainly does, you know, those don't have all of the kinds of features that we would want to have in a URI scheme. So I think if other institutions have established patterns for minting and have thought through some of the questions raised in the email, it'd be great to have a really robust discussion about that, as well as about differentiating between the different types of URIs, you know, the URIs used in linked art for accessing linked art representations, and whether those are different from URIs that appear in other kinds of linked data and might be the URIs that an institution wants to rely on as the definitive identifier for an entity.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a particularly interesting one. Where do you want the, you know, do we generally think of the URI in the data say for an object, as the authoritative official persistent URI for that object. And then if so, when you dereference it as a human, you probably would expect to get some HTML to look at. But if it's also the URI that is the ID in the linked data, a machine would expect to get linked data back, and in our case, linked art. At which point, we would be essentially requiring content negotiation both for the producer and the consumer of the data, and whether that is whether the web infrastructure and toolkits that we have access to would make that sufficiently easy that we could require it, or whether it's something that you might expect to encounter, or whether it's something that we think it would be an anti-pattern and we should recommend against. So yeah, if we think about that from the sort of implementation perspective at our various institutions, I think would be really a really useful discussion for Philadelphia. And then just to, since we also didn't get to it, levels of implementation. This issue is whether or not there are features, or sets of features rather, that we can call out as being, this is the basic level that everyone has to implement in order to call themselves linked art at all. Must have a type, must have a label and or an identifier, should have XYZ. And then if you do that for all of the different representations, you can then say perhaps 3 levels of complexity, whether the most complex has all of the features and the least complex has only those features that are absolutely necessary for basic understanding. Whether that is a direction that we want to pursue, or whether we don't think that's a direction at all that we want to do, or whether there's something that we would pursue when there is more than a couple of implementations, because we just don't have enough information yet as to what is easy and common and what is hard or rare. So yeah, that also would be I think a very good discussion to have in Philadelphia. All right, so thank you everyone. Stop there. I know that folks have other calls or home to be going to, so leave it there. So there won't be a call in 2 weeks' time because most of us will be in Philadelphia. Safe travels, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sorry.